Hello, today we're here with poet Tim Seibles, National Book Award finalist, poet laureate of Virginia. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, Phil.
Um,
Uh,
I'm going to ask you to read your contribution to Sign and Breath, and then we're going to talk about it.
all right. This poem is called Come Home, Lady. Without you, the seconds limp like sad millipedes in hard shoes. Minutes sag like bad lectures in late afternoon. Like old men out of smokes, the hours itch and fidget. But soon, your smile, that shard of shooting star, that softly candling chandelier will take my room. Your hips, slick wheels for a hot race. When I see you, my soul is a sous chef. My heart rubs itself a zest worthy of your mouth. Your kiss, April clarinet for this grim November. Big orange crush for my dust bunny life. Oh, let me be that one come hither morsel, that savory flavor and shine on your lips. What sorrow but a grown man stuffed in the trunk of his worry? Your legs, lady, your legs, long as an Alaskan summer day, that easy gait, your velvet thighs, your deeply wise and wicked ways. When I see you, we will dance like bumper cars on rubber streets, like lazy ducks on crazy lakes, like hippos and hobos in toe shoes.
And that's wonderful. And I've heard you, of course, not just on a Zoom platform, but in front of hundreds of appreciative audience members. Tell me a little bit about your process of composition and how that dual role of both oral poet and poet on the page, how that affects the way you work.
Well, I mean, when I'm writing, I am often saying the lines aloud. Even if no one can hear them, I may be sitting in a public place, I'll be muttering them just loud enough so I can hear them, which allows me to get a sense of rhythm and a sense of, the assonance and consonants. If I'm really playing heavily with it, which in that poem I am, it gives me a sense of how those things are actually working. In my mind, I always think of poems as being spoken. Read, of course, I've read many poems and loved many poems just on the page, but in the ideal world of my mind, poetry would be read and heard, because there's another kind of life in the actual utterance of the poem. And that's the thing that I lean on quite a bit. Beyond that, I think my process is probably like yours or like any other serious poet. You're trying to get it said right. So you write and you rewrite and you rewrite and you rethink and you rewrite some more, So that's probably, I don't think there's anything particularly unique about that. Perhaps the idea that I hear poems in my head when I'm reading them when I'm writing them is different. Some people say they see the words in their head, like they see them. That's not my experience. I hear the words in my head, and that's partly why I always think of poems as being said. I mean, people ask me why I read the way I do, and I've said many times, and I'll say it again today, I try to read the poems the way I hear them. I hear them in my head a certain way, so I'm really trying to mimic the voice in my head. That's what I'm doing.
Right. Tim, that poem is in one way very typical of the poems that are going to be in your new book, New and Selected Poems, in the sense that it involves celebration of people. There's a lot of people in your poems. And yet at the same time, you can also be cuttingly critical, as in the villanelles for George Bush, for instance, or other things. Tell me about the role of people and celebration and cultural criticism that you bring to poems.
Okay. Well, I mean, our lives are, of course, informed by people. So people populate our worlds outside and inside. I mean, so many of the things I think about are memories of people or places I've been with people or people I've met, people I've been friends with, people I've been in love with, people, who bore me enmity, enmity, so people are all over my mind anyway. And so I think when I write, I was saying moments ago that I hear the poems in my head, and maybe I'm more specifically, maybe I should say, I imagine speaking poems to people, to someone, I think of poems as part of like an ongoing conversation throughout human history. We're just talking, I'm talking certainly to my time and people that I know, of course, but I'm also talking to people like Langston Hughes, Pablo Neruda, Walt Whitman, Anne Sexton, Lucille Clifton, and of course my many contemporaries, poets, so I feel like I'm in this conversation, and it may not be specific call and response exactly, but I'm hearing your work, for example, and I'm listening to how you work music, and I'm listening to this very kind of plain speech that William Stafford might use, and then some of the really bitter images that Sexton might employ, and the super compression that Lucille Clifton employs in her work. And so I'm talking indirectly in many cases to these people who have affected the way I think about poems. I mean, all the time. I mean, and then when we step back from the people who influence us, our contemporaries and those historical influences, then you're also talking to the people of your time. I mean, when I read a poem aloud in front of an audience, I am hoping that they're hearing me as a citizen of the world like they are. Like I'm talking to you, and you may not be talking back directly, but the conversation is ongoing, hopefully in their heads, So that's part of how I'm thinking. I might have missed part of your question though. Oh, cultural criticism, sorry. Yeah, well, I do think if you're lucky enough to be literate and you're lucky enough to have developed an art, whatever it is, happens to be writing, then you have to use it to talk about what you see, because that's a way of engaging life, of course, and also a way of encouraging or inviting your fellow citizens to see what you see, and or at least to follow your perceptions as far as they can. They may say, no, I don't think the world is in those terms at all. But even in the moment that they disagree with you, they have been obliged to think perhaps in a way that they hadn't before. Certainly that has been true for my own life. When I'm reading someone, and I may not necessarily like their aesthetic all the time, or I may see the world in terms that are, I don't know, more raging or more sensual or whatever, I still am obliged to think along with them as I read. And that's really what I want of poems that, assail racism or assail war machinery, or poems that criticize a president. I'm trying to say, essentially, isn't it like this? Do you see what I mean? Essentially is what I'm saying. Do you see what I mean? Isn't this the way? Isn't this thing I see? Isn't this true? And of course, people are certainly they can disagree and say, no, Seibles, you're a lunatic. You crazy liberals don't know anything. But the idea is that, I mean, if this is a democracy, then we should be, shouting and, brandishing our fists spiritually and saying, damn it, I think this. And I think to the extent that we have a vibrant literary community, we also have potential anyway, a really vibrant general citizenry. If we can get people to read, if we can get people to listen to poems and come to readings, I think it really changes the dynamics of a society. I mean, this may sound like fantasy, but nonetheless, it's what I think.
It doesn't sound like fantasy to me, Tim. It sounds like a program. Sounds like
Okay.
what must be done. You know, before we started recording, that you had been visiting a school. You're retired.
Yeah.
Tell me
Yes.
about your interaction with young people in poetry. What do you
Oh,
find?
well, I mean, that's among my favorite things actually as a writer and a teacher. Because I think oftentimes teenagers or any students who are, too young to have had any experience studying poetry with, for example, a poet such as yourself, and they've only heard maybe poetry treated like a unit in a class, and they had to learn iambic pentameter and make sure they got all the symbols right. Oftentimes, young students have a pretty narrow idea of what a poem can be. And so one of my favorite things is to be able to say, here's a poem, check out this poem, check out this poem, check out this poem. And bit by bit, sometimes the lights will go on for them. They'll think, oh, so a poem can talk like that? So a poem can say these things? This doesn't sound like Robert Frost, because a lot of them, that's all they know what's the favorite Frost poem? The one about the horse and the snow. And
I think I know.
yes, yeah, yes. That one. God, that's all they know. And Frost himself should be wildly insulted by that being the only poem of his they know. But yeah, so the idea for me anyway, the primary thing I love is the idea that maybe the poetry becomes a living thing for them, that they suddenly think, oh, I could write a poem, or I wouldn't mind reading a poem, or if someone wants to read a poem, I'll listen because I think poetry might be kind of cool. That's my main thing in high schools, to get students to expand their idea of what a poem is so that they'll be receptive to the information and the music and the news that only poems can carry. And I think that if I feel that has happened after I leave a classroom, I feel pretty good. Doesn't mean they're all going to be reading poems every day, but it means that a few of them will take poetry to heart in a way that they might not have otherwise.
Tim Seibles, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Phil.
And we're looking forward to Voodoo Libretto, your next book.
Thank you, sir. I hope it will be worth a read or two.